everybody for coming. We are having a great time at B-Sides Tampa, and we're going to go ahead and get over to our next speaker. So with us today, we have Mr. Eric Woodruff. Eric, throughout his 23-year career in IT, Eric has sought out and held a diverse range of roles, including technical manager in the public sector, senior premier field engineer at Microsoft, and security and identity architect at the Microsoft partner ecosystem. Currently, he is the product technical specialist at Simperis, focusing on ITDR and cloud identity resilience. Eric is a Microsoft MVP for security, recognized for his expertise in the Microsoft identity ecosystem. Outside of work, Eric supports the professional community, providing his insights and expertise at conferences, participating in the ID Pro Body of Knowledge Committee, and blogging about Entra and related cloud security topics. Without further ado, Eric Woodruff.
Oh, there we go. All right. I always feel like I sound more full of myself when I hear that read out. Yep, Eric Woodruff. I'm Eric on Identity. Right, it's sort of easy to remember, Eric on Identity. Social media handles, I sort of have a lot of content within here, right, and sort of blue defense stuff can get very dry and heavy, and I'm going to try to keep it light, but along with leaving some time for Q&A, if you want the slides, you know, just to find me on one of these socials and I'll share this stuff out afterwards. Yeah, so let's get into it. As far as the agenda today, right? So we're going to sort of talk about the mindset of securing privileged users and the, you know, Microsoft ecosystem of things, right? And talk about why we need to do this stuff, why it's important, and then, you know, the things we need to do. So try to keep it pretty straightforward here. Right, well, we'll have a little sort of story first here as we talk about the mindset, right? So I live in New York, the Northeast. I love going up to Maine, love hiking, and up in Acadia National Park. So if you're ever up there, would suggest you check out Acadia. There's Precipice Trail, and it's sort of hard to see here, but kind of like to the right of the gray rock is basically falling to your death. And so at the foot of the trail, there's this sign here, right? And we have things where, like, you know, make sure you don't bring your dog, stay on the trail, you know, don't hike in the dark or the rain or if it's snowing out, right? Wear hiking shoes and, you know, don't do silly things like throw rocks, right? And sort of if you do these things, right, you'll probably make it to the top of the mountain and you'll be alive and, you know, able to come speak in warmer places like Tampa. But right, even if you don't do all these things, like if I decide to wear my sneakers, right, it's very likely that I'll still make it to the top of the mountain, right? And so I kind of look at it as defense in depth, right? So when we talk about securing identities and systems like M365 and Azure, right, like zero trust is sort of like the big thing that gets thrown out a lot, but honestly, I like to look at it from a defense in depth model, right? And so when we talk about defense in depth, again, it's effectively an onion, right, that we can apply, or it's layers of an onion if we try to think about defense in depth, right? And usually if you look at that defense in depth model, right, there's like physical, you know, perimeter and network layers and identity and access, and it's data in the middle, but you can really apply this to anything, right? So in this case, it's going to be Entra ID in the middle. And I'll just sort of highlight here, right, for many folks, this may be something you already know, but for those that don't, right, if you live in the Microsoft ecosystem, right, whether you love it or hate it, if you have Office 365 or Microsoft 365 or Azure, right, the identity piece is Entra ID under the covers. So when we talk about securing privileged users, like your global administrators, right, it's Entra there, and you know, I've encountered customers who weren't necessarily aware that they have Entra, right? They just think they have Microsoft services. So when we sort of talk about securing privilege in these systems, it's all kind of, you know, one and the same when we're talking about that highly privileged user. Right, so also just to kind of level set things here, right, let's talk about what a privileged role is. Now, Microsoft has 21 roles that they've defined as privileged. And again, there's a lot on this, you know, slide here, and you don't need to really remember all this stuff. primarily, we want to focus on securing your global administrators, right? And your global administrators are like the domain admin of the cloud. And again, right, domain admins in Active Directory sort of language is the thing that gets popped and then everyone has a bad day because nothing works anymore. Global admin is that domain admin on the cloud. And, I would say I have a very informed opinion that it's only going to get worse before it gets better out in the cloud, because the speed that attackers can start to move through cloud systems, right, is much quicker than they can move through on-prem systems. And the ways that we can sort of infiltrate, right, cloud is easier, and we'll kind of dive into that, right? So global admin, it's like domain admin, but worse. And then from an iterative perspective, right, once we secure our global admins, we can go back and secure some of these other roles that we could essentially call these as, tier 0, those highly privileged users, because they may not be the keys of the kingdom, but they can sort of either directly or indirectly give themselves or gain access to the keys of the kingdom, right? So, but I think one other thing, from a proactive perspective, I spent some time working at Microsoft, and I ran Azure AD, which is now Entra ID, security assessments for organizations. And one of the mindsets and the shifts where I think we need to change things, right, is it's always like trying to boil the ocean, right? Everyone wants to focus on, well, we can't do all the security things, and it's all very difficult. But if we just focus, right, especially on like global admin, right, hopefully it's not too many users that we're impacting, right? And another term sort of in the Microsoft world is right, dog fooding. It's like, right, eating your own dog food, sort of testing your own stuff out, right? So, I've managed teams before where we implemented some of this stuff, and they may have hated me for it, but right, we're sort of in control of our own destiny here when it comes to privilege if you manage privileged systems, right? So, a lot of this stuff, right, implement against yourself. You can sort of tune it, see what works, see what doesn't, and then, right, start to talk about other roles. And again, if it's Office 365, you might have Exchange admins, SharePoint admins, other people, right? But you can sort of figure out what works. And, it's tough because it can turn into a sort of, it depends, right? I consulted for a while. It's one of my favorite things to say, right, as far as what is privileged. So again, now, why is this our problem? A lot of times also we sort of have this security versus usability struggle, right? Where if we want things to be usable, then they're not very secure. And a lot of people would probably argue that, Microsoft services are more usable, right? Because they want all your money, right? And so they want to make things easy out of the box. But also we've seen organizations that will, turn all the dials up to 11, and then effectively, if everything is too secure, right, that's when we get shadow IT. Our users are sort of like our biggest enemy at this point because they will find ways to work around things, right? So for a user perspective, we want to find that sort of middle ground. But here we're really focusing again on those privileged users. And right, if we just focus on global admins, those highly privileged users, right, that's where we really do want to try to turn the knobs and dials up to 11. But there are some things within here, right, where it doesn't have to mean that we all sort of hate our life every morning that we go to work. So, and also though, relative to why it's our problem, right, is the shared responsibility model. So if we take Entra ID, an identity as a service platform, which is effectively a SaaS system here, right? Every shared responsibility model is a little different depending on the cloud provider. But right, if we look at Microsoft here, right, accounts and identities, they're the customer's problem, right? You know who your employees are, you know who's supposed to have access to what, right? Microsoft does not. And the identity and directory infrastructure, right? And this is split where, aside from like the whole Storm 0558 incident, right? Generally, it's Microsoft's problem to protect the back end of things. But again, right, we're the only ones that know, like, Tony in HR should have different conditional access policies for getting to Workday because Tony's got access to PII or something, right? And so a lot of the infrastructure, as you might call it, for a SaaS platform is still really up to us, right? Microsoft doesn't know your business, you know your business, and it's sort of our job, right, to sort of apply the security controls that are made available to our end users and our privileged users, right? So why is this important? Going back to what I was saying about sort of the ease of access and the ability for, attackers to sort of hit the cloud, right? I mean, we basically have the management plane out here. So this is, all the portals, admin.microsoft, portal.azure, Entra.microsoft, right? All our APIs or PowerShell modules, all these things. And then you have the control plane, again, is Entra ID, right? And there's this symbiotic relationship here because we have our users and our privileged users in Entra ID here. Right, and you have to use the same management plane that, right, anyone can go to portal.azure and type in any username they want, right? Nothing's going to stop them. And if they have credentials for a privileged user, right, depending on how things are configured, nothing's going to stop them, right? And then they get into your control plane, right? And the control plane is what sort of dictates who can get to the management plane, right? So, a lot of times the focus is on the control plane, but when we look at the management plane, right, it also expands out to all these other things that we likely have within our estate, right? So, again, speaking about a global admin here, if our global admin gets popped, right, then an attacker can move into the management plane. And if we talk about our SaaS applications again, right, like everything's SaaS, your Workday, your Salesforce, right, all these things. We talk about going back to on-prem. Well, there's no on-prem Salesforce. There's no on-prem Workday, right? So SaaS applications are a fact of life. And if you have access in Entra, it's relatively easy to spoof users through SAML claims. And SAML primarily is the way a lot of these things are integrated still, to move into these SaaS applications and impersonate users. And it can be very difficult to sort of track this stuff down. Right, same with multi-cloud. A lot of organizations, may use Entra for their AWS and GCP and all these things. And again, same sort of techniques used to move into SaaS applications, you can use to move into other multi-cloud, right, federated management planes and, have privileges there. Right, so PaaS, right? So this is one of the things where the management plane, we can go into Azure Key Vault or, app services or whatever it is, right? And in the management plane there, in the portal, you can go say, hey, well, now I want to have access to whatever's in the data plane, right? I want to grant myself access to whatever this juicy stuff is in Key Vault, right? And again, move laterally. And also your IaaS stuff, right? So through portal.azure, if you have a Windows VM or VMs that are, say, like domain controllers running out there, you can go run a one-liner through the run command and essentially give yourself access to that VM, right? And if it's a DC, you can go give yourself a domain admin account. And if you look at, things like Arc, right, which is popular for sort of extending the management plane of Azure to other IaaS systems, again, whether it's on-prem or, in AWS, you can go run commands in Arc to basically grant yourself local access, right, to those systems. And again, if it's like a domain controller in particular, right, you can go give yourself creds there. So the ability to sort of spread into all the things, right, and honestly, most organizations are not mature enough to detect these things at the speed that, right, someone that was skilled could move through this stuff. So nobody's probably able to read this, even if you were sitting an inch from it. This is from the Microsoft Digital Defense Report from 2023. And so we'll just sort of zoom in on things, right? So this page I pulled from it is talking about, right, sort of the common findings that they have within their incident response team, right? So Microsoft Dart, and now I think it's just Microsoft Incident Response, as if you're a Microsoft customer and you have some sort of incident and, right, you call them in. A lot of that data rolls into their digital defense report, right? And so some of the common sort of findings that they have, right, are insecure configuration of identity platform. And it's a bit wordy here, right? But we're talking about misconfiguration and exposure of identity platforms. So they're covering both Entra ID and Active Directory here, right? And their components are common vectors for attackers to gain unauthorized high privilege access. So they're not sort of making statements, right? This is rolling in from them going in and, responding to incidents. Or they're not theorizing, I guess I should say, right? Insufficient privileged access and lateral movement controls. Again, right in here, this is really focused on our privileged users, right? Excessive permissions across the digital environment, right? All that stuff we just talked about. And often exposed administrative credentials on workstations, subject to internet and productivity tasks. The TLDR on this is people are not separating privilege, right? People have too much privilege. We're not using dedicated workstations, things like that. And then no multi-factor or lack of modern MFA mechanisms. And very cliche here, today's attackers don't break in, they log in, right? So this does move into, though, phishing-resistant authentication or, the lack thereof of it. And unfortunately, my lab is sort of in a state of disarray, so we'll have to just have a pre-recorded video here. But what I wanted to show folks is, has anyone here played with Evil Genix? Okay, so, right, if you haven't, for those that haven't, just going to walk through and basically show you how easy it is to get credentials, even using Authenticator app push notifications, right? So over the past few years, Microsoft sort of, right, there's been a move to passwordless, and you get the push, and you do the number matching and all that stuff on your phone, right? But it's not actually phishing resistant, right? We're all waiting for passkeys, right? There's FIDO2 keys, hello for business, all these things. But for a lot of orgs that are just going passwordless, right, it's not good enough. And right, if I'll get this started here, right, so on our right, we've got the sort of attacker view, and this is sort of post, the person's already fallen for the link here, right? We're just sort of speeding things up. So on our left is right the target, right? So they've got this phishing link. We've got Evil Genix running here on our right. Probably could have cut some of the time on the video here, but right, so we're going to authenticate here, and this could be a privileged user who also, unfortunately, is not using privilege separation, right? And I mean, these systems, as this goes through, are pretty slick because, right, these proxies will mirror all of your any customization you have, right, in the sign-in page for Office 365. Right, and so we can see actually here that on the left, the user signed in, they don't know anything's happened. On the right, Evil Genix essentially has their credentials, right? We've got their session here, and we're going to look at their session cookie, and then we just replay this, right, in a browser. Now, I mean, again, in a real phishing scenario, it's usually a bit more complicated in how they pass those credentials along to a different system to use them, right? But here we're just using cookie editor. We're just going to go drop that cookie that we captured in Evil Genix into our browser session here. Right, and so for people that have not seen this before, this should be scary because, like, my kid could probably do this, and he probably could do it better than I am, right? So we've got the cookie in there. We hit refresh, right? And now we're essentially in there as this user here, right? So if you think of that as your global administrator, right, or a privileged user, right, and we all like to, I just came from this session about phishing, right, think that we're not going to fall for it. But, right, realistically, everyone at some point is going to fall for some sort of, phish, right? And we want to make sure that that's not happening to our privileged users here. So let me. All right, so let's talk about what we need to do here to secure our privileged access. So we've got our privileged user up here. And right, the first thing we want to talk about is those strong credentials, right, in Entra ID. So the strong credentials assigned to the user that we're going to use on our devices. I don't know how washed out it is if you're looking straight onto this, but, cat's in front of a laptop late at night here, right? So as we go through, and this is where it starts to get a bit dry, but just sort of hang in here with me. Again, if we focus on our global administrators, the sort of quadrant in the upper right here is effectively like the time and effort that it should take organizations to implement this. And again, I'm talking about just your global admins at first, right? If we were to extend this out to all the things and we try to boil the ocean, right, that probably will move up to more time and effort. But it goes back to thinking of this from an iterative approach, right? Start small and then sort of gain speed and acceleration here, right? So for these strong credentials, again, we want to have those dedicated privileged creds, right? We want to configure them to not have mail enabled or have mail forwarding, right? Because we don't want the administrator to, be reading their work email or whatnot and click on some phishing link and something bad happens, right? And again, we can say, well, we've got, all the things, we've got the EDRs and the XDRs and all that great stuff, and it's great, right? But you still see phishing links, slip through the cracks. You still see malware slip through the cracks, right? And again, from a defense in depth perspective, having two sets of creds isn't necessarily the end of the world to have to deal with, especially when you hold high privileges. We also want these to be cloud native and sourced from Entra ID. So there's too many known attack paths, right, to move from Active Directory into Entra ID, right? So if you're hybrid identity where you have AD, right, whether it's abusing systems within Entra Connect or some abuses out there for pass-through authentication, or just your privileged users, depending on how your Active Directory is structured, may not actually be privileged in AD, right? And so you can see all these crazy attack paths where people can own, right, creds in Active Directory and then use it to move into Entra. Right, and this is where we want to get into using phishing-resistant authentication whenever we can. Unfortunately, right, it's on the cusp of public preview with passkey support in Entra ID. Microsoft's sort of been pushing it off every sort of month here. I'm hoping to see this soon, right, once passkeys come out. Again, another tool for organizations to give a... If there's any questions as I go through this, feel free to just raise your hand. But so when I say passkeys, right, passkeys, for those that do not know, are FIDO2. It's essentially a FIDO2 security key, but on a device, right? So being able to use a mobile device and actually have that be phishing-resistant authentication. It's not a Microsoft-specific thing, right? The FIDO Alliance has been working on passkeys now for the past couple years. And also use Entra ID Premium 2 for privileged users, right? So this isn't always easy to obtain necessarily, depending on how you buy your Microsoft licensing. But but remember that you don't have to go buy 50,000, M365 or P2 licenses, right? You've got 10 highly privileged users, 20 privileged users, right? Whatever that number may be. You can mix and match things here, right? So we can go get P2 licensing for your global admins, right? And it's only going to run you a couple $100 a month, right? Not whatever it'd take to buy E5 for 100,000 users, right? So now we're going to go access the management plane here, and we do want to introduce PIM, right? And again, some folks may also mention PAM at this point, and I have nothing against the CyberArks and Beyond Trust or anything here. Just the world I come from is sort of living within the Microsoft ecosystem. So we're trying to not incur additional costs, right? And this is very cloud centric. So, we're primarily talking about PIM here, which again would be like a P2 license thing. Right, so with these privilege roles, and if we're talking about our global administrators, right, we want to make sure that we require, right, PIM for those users. But we want to actually limit the activation duration to 1 to 2 hours, right? So out of the box, this is 8 hours. I've seen organizations turn the dial up on this to 24. I mean, while PIM is great, if I've activated my role, right at that point, if someone steals my creds, they also are me with those credentials activated. And if at 9 in the morning I roll into work and just activate my privilege, right, regardless of what I plan on doing that day, and then just spend the entire day working as a global admin. Even if I don't need global admin, I leave and it, right, PIM knocks it back down. I mean, I might as well just not even use PIM, right? Because that's still a huge window of time, right, where you have standing privileges, right, if you have global admin 40 hours a week activated on your account. So, right, we want to try to tune that down, right? And this could turn into a whole sprawl of a conversation, but try to limit the activation duration for something like global administrator. Also, a lot of orgs may work with consultants or vendors or MSPs or CSPs or whatever, right, where it's always been an issue as well to sort of tune these things with PIM where, say, right, we want to maybe have approvals required for a consultant to elevate to like global admin, right, where someone has to approve that, but we don't want them to have to approve like employees activating the global admin access. So we can use PIM-enabled groups, right, where effectively we assign groups to the role of global admin, but then to elevate into those groups, right, we can then be granular in saying, like, if it's, you know, contractors or vendors, right, they have to go through some approval workflow versus if it's employees, maybe they don't. And there's other things, right, because this sort of increases the surface area that we need to make sure that those groups aren't something that then can be abused, right, to sort of go, you know, move up into global admin. But it does provide some flexibility that was sort of missing for many years here. And also, we want to require authentication context over MFA for role activation. So this is something that's been out for a couple years, but it isn't heavily used, right? So again, with PIM, we could go say, hey, like when you're going to elevate your role, you know, you have to multi-factor, right? If you already have multi-factored and it's right within your claims, you're going to see that you're not asked to MFA again. Authentication context allows us to do things like say, hey, if you want to elevate your privilege, you need to be coming from a compliant device. I kind of like to think of it almost as like a loop back to conditional access for PIM, right? So authentication context gives you a lot of that granularity of conditional access, right? In saying, hey, you need to like meet these conditions in order to elevate your privilege. Also enforce and audit your least privileged roles. And I know this can be tough for some orgs. I mean, I worked at a place where our CTO was a global admin because he was the CTO. I've worked with companies where they're like, we're in the same scenario, right? And we need you to come in and be like the bad guy and, you know, say, take the CTO out of global admin, right? But you do see these things where people will have standing privilege, right? Because they're important in the company, or you don't want to hurt people's feelings on teams, right? I worked in public sector, so like half the stuff you deal with is, you know, politics and, you know, all that sort of stuff, right? But it's easy, right? If you have a SIM, or even if you don't, depending on your licensing, right, you can at least look at the last month's worth of activity in Entra and see who's really been actually using these privileges. And this also gets into, right, there's a whole ball within this that I'll spare you folks from, right, but it's really identity governance for privileged users, right? Again, very common thing you see is someone changes their roles in an organization, or they leave, or, you know, retire or fired or whatnot, right? But they have that separate account, but it's not managed by HR or other processes, and like it still persists, right? So we want to make sure that we have a life cycle around these privileged user accounts. All right. So we are going to introduce, right, MDR, XDR, EDR, all these things against our devices here, right? And we want to have these hardened, dedicated workstations. But I will say, especially as we get into this, because what I'm going to talk about is one of everyone's, well, people I work with, least favorite things are privileged access workstations, right? Basically, everyone hates these. It does require a lot of time and effort. But if you were to sort of look at some of these components, right, even if it's just getting another asset, right, from IT and just having a separate device that you're working from, even if you don't do all the hardening things with an Intune and all the stuff out there, right? Like something is better than nothing when we're talking about privileged access workstations, right? And this really gets into the clean source principle, right, which is a big Microsoft thing. And I'll have a diagram here in a second that kind of helps illustrate this, right? But it's essentially saying that if you're accessing highly privileged systems, right, and this throws back to the Active Directory days. If you're accessing tier 0 systems, the system you're coming from needs to be right sort of on the same tier, right? So if you're on like your desktop, that's likely not tier 0. You don't want to be RDPing into a domain controller, right? Similarly, if you're doing global admin stuff, you don't want to be right coming in from the shared family computer or something like that, right? Where your kid was just doing who knows what, playing Roblox or Minecraft or all sorts of scenarios that really lend to why privileged access workstations work, right? So a lot of guidance from Microsoft that I'm not going to sort of dive into here, but I would say right that the user is not a local administrator on these devices, right? To do privileged stuff in the cloud, you don't need to have local admin on the device, right? You want to install Azure CLI or whatever the latest PowerShell modules are, right? There's ways to do this stuff and orchestrate that where you don't need local admin. But there is a trade-off here, right? Especially, again, if we're talking about like if we're sticking in Microsoft world and we've got the Intune team, right? They now are effectively also indirectly global admins, right? Even if you're not using Pause, but you have Intune, they also are effectively global admins, right? Because they have a lot of influence over the devices you use. Right, so this is like the old sort of model. So if you've been around the block for a while and you've managed or worked with Active Directory, you may see this, right? And so effectively that top horizontal, right, is the device you're coming from needs to always remain within the same tier as whatever you're managing. And right now, Microsoft, they've come out with a lot of new fancy guidance, but essentially it's just that, but flipped, right? So now it's a vertical where for privileged security, right, for our global admins, we want to be using Pause for accessing, right, all the management plane, control plane sort of stuff. And so lastly here, right, we want to make sure that we're using identity protection, which again is a P2 thing, conditional access, which is P1, right? So if you cannot get P2, but if you have, P1 licensing that you can use conditional access, right? We want to build conditional access policies that are targeting our privileged users. I've seen a lot of orgs where there's too much sprawl here with conditional access policies, right, where we don't need to sort of over-engineer and over-orchestrate this. You can get by with some conditional access policies that are, minimal for your privileged users, but we do want to target them, right, with robust conditional access policies, right, that are leveraging device compliance, right? Like, don't let them come in from a personal device. Again, I've worked with some very large organizations where you'd see some of the craziest stuff that they would allow where effectively they were coming in from like personal devices to manage their estate. And you're asking them like, well, what would happen, right, if this all sort of went away or was ransomed or, threat actor did something, and they're sort of like, well, we'd be out of business. And you're like, okay, well, implementing a conditional access policy against these 10 users would take us like 15 minutes to apply, right? We also can use device filtering. So beyond just having device compliance, you can build filters. So if you deploy PAW, right, you can make sure that they're coming from a privileged access workstation. Again, the identity protection one is big here, right? And while we are sort of going passwordless, and one of the big things with identity protection that I've always thought is slick was the whole leak credential thing, right? Where it sort of crawls the web, or Microsoft crawls the web, right? Looking for, username and password in a sandbox that tries to authenticate effectively as you, right? And if the hash is matched, then they know they found leak creds. And right, there's the whole big AI, Copilot, all that sort of nonsense stuff that is newer, but identity protection has been like ML for 6-something years that they've been using this, right? So I think it has a pretty proven track record. It can be difficult to sort of understand what some of the detections in it mean at times, right? But for your anomalous travel, sort of odd signals from authentication, all these things, right? So protecting against people coming through Tor and all these other things, right? VPN anonymizers, it works quite well. those strong authentication requirements. So now again, right, we can say where earlier we're looking at making sure that we're using like FIDO2 keys, pass keys, right, these sorts of things to authenticate our global admins. We can again require that now. It's not just the MFA on-off switch. There's authentication strengths that we can define out there in Entra. And one of the things now, generally, I find sign-in frequency is very hurtful to our end users, right? But again, from a defense in depth perspective, you know, a lot of folks argue that having a sign-in frequency, right, of, you know, somewhere between 4 to 8 hours against your global admins, right? It's one of those things where it's time-based, and these days time-based security stuff is sort of not always the greatest, right? But essentially sign-in frequency would say, right, if we have it set to 8 hours, that if you're in the portal and you're doing things, that after 8 hours, you're basically going to get, right, forced to have to re-authenticate. If you start to do things like if you have a PAW that you're using, like say Hello for Business, and this is like a cloud-only PAW, right? There's ways that can sort of mitigate some of the interference this would have with a privileged user, though, because things like Hello for Business will actually push back the. It will renew your primary refresh token, and your sign-in frequency will be extended out. So I'm getting in the weeds, so I'll slash that rant there, because again, you could easily talk about any of these things for like hours on end, and you know, get into all the minutia of it. So one last thing I just want to leave off here, though, with our privileged users, right, is making sure that we have break glass accounts, right, and we want to make sure that we have 2 break glass accounts. So there was a issue this past March where there was some problem. A lot of organizations had conditional access policies, right? And this isn't even from like a security perspective. It's as much of like a sort of operational resilience thing where all of a sudden a lot of people in certain parts of the world all started coming from like the same location. And it's because there was some, you know, done goof that happened with like the database that Microsoft uses to correlate IP ranges with, you know, geolocations, right? And a lot of organizations had policies that are like, if you're not in whatever country we're in, block access, which is in itself, again, something that you will see some organizations use and can be useful. However, now all of a sudden the entire org was locked out of, right, their estate because all their users appear to be coming from someplace else in the world. If you had your break glass account, right, at least for, what is it, 8 hours, however long it took Microsoft to fix it, right, you could have sort of backdoored in, adjusted your conditional access policies for the day, and sort of let everyone get back to business here. So it's not just a security thing, it's also, you know, provides operational resilience. We do want to exclude one from conditional access policies, though, right, because everything breaks, and we don't want conditional access to be a thing that's going to get in the way of, you know, one of these accounts, right? So it's almost like tiered, where we have the break glass, and then we have like the really break glass account. We're also one as permanent assignment in PIM. So if you're using PIM, right, it's not eligible for a role, it's active. Again, you can sort of go out there every few months and see Twitter or I guess X, right, complaining about some sort of problem with PIM. You know, it works great, but there are times, again, where something gets hung up and it takes forever to elevate your privileges, right? And if you've got something you got to get done now because there's some sort of fire, right? Have that one permanently assigned so you're not waiting to elevate privilege. And also, again, right, most of these things, if it's requiring MFA and the whole team quits, right, you have some way to, everyone wins the lottery and everyone walks off, right, that you have an account to sort of get back into things with. But these accounts should be highly monitored, right? So you see any authentication activity coming from your break glass, like all the alarms, all the bells and whistles, and all your SIMs and all these things should be going off. And those passwords should be securely managed, right? And there's a lot of different strategies for that. However, again, if it's like using Key Vault or keeping it in some other, right, system like password management, just realize that that's also now tier 0, and you could easily get into sort of long rants about how the more things you do, right, you're increasing that attack surface area, and the accounts that manage like, right? Your CyberArk now also are indirectly global administrators. But using, again, FIDO2 security keys can be an alternative for this, right? Again, you'd want to have N+1. You can register up to 10 on an account right now, right? Microsoft, I was actually very surprised for the longest time. They would never sort of admit in their documentation to using FIDO2 security keys, mostly because it's creating a dependency, right, on something that they don't control because it's relying on vendors. But it is actually out there in the docs now. Right, and again, earlier when I was talking about defense in depth, right, in the sort of classic defense in depth model here, right, and this is where, when we're talking about securing privilege, right, we can apply all these things, right, to protect our privileged users sort of there on the inside. So, questions? Oh, yeah.
Does it make sense to have service accounts in your environment with global admin rights from a security stance to keep the environment secured?
No, I mean, I would say that, I mean, it's going to be, it depends. I don't know what all the use cases are for 99.99 whatever % of them, like no, right? And so I didn't actually cover service principles in here sort of in an effort from a time perspective. If you have service accounts, they should actually be service principals whenever they can. They should not be users. And quite honestly, they should not hold global admin. Like almost everything that you could think of what you'd want them to do shouldn't need GA. Right, I know some vendors, again, may argue otherwise. Many times it's just because the vendor doesn't know what they're doing. No offense to vendors, because I work for one. But yeah, I know that's sort of like a non-answer, but...
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. My use case was backup solution,
Yep.
where they needed full access to everything.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say it gets sort of muddy right at times because I'll say, so I'm at Semperis, we make software for doing Entra things, and it can get real complex with permissions because unfortunately there are some things in the GA role that you can't easily do with other things. And so I don't know, is it also backing up like your Office 365 and all that stuff? Yeah. Yeah. No, it can be tough. I would push back on them somewhat, or at least to sort of explain, right, like why you need these permissions, or have them at least say, right, like, well, we want to do this thing, and if you look at like, right, the roles here, we can only do it with like GA, right, and you can sort of weigh the risk there.
So yeah, regarding the conditional access with the P1, right?
Yep.
You said you can do the device conditional access with devices, right?
Yeah. So, and actually, because now
What
I'm,
device compliance? I think that's what it said.
yeah. So I'm actually trying to think from a, to keep me honest, perspective, if E3 comes with all the Intune things or not. It does. Okay. Then yeah, you could do device compliance with P1.
And that's with Intunes and all that stuff. Right?
Yeah, I mean, if you have, there's vendors that work with Microsoft. What's the VMware one? I can't think of that does MDM, and there's a few others as well that if you're not using Intune,
Right.
but they sort of cooperate with the Microsoft ecosystem, and they can sort of like inform.
Because it's identity based, even though it says device compliance.
Well, no, so it is based on the device. So the device's compliance is actually reported through the MDM platform into, Intune, and then that informs, Entra of whether the device is compliant.
So you do have to have Intune or something like that. Right?
Yes, you need to have some. You need to have some sort of MDM solution that can sort of measure whether the device is compliant or not.
So we use ConnectWise to manage those remote devices. Here's my question,
Yeah.
right? So if I use that, let's say it does integrate with it and it works, right?
Yeah.
My question is, could we do something in regards to, let's say we have remote users that don't always use a certain laptop,
Yeah.
and their patches, they haven't turned on in 3 months, so obviously they're not patch compliant.
Yeah.
as soon as they turn it on, is there a policy or a setting that can say, okay, you can't connect to your tenant
Yep.
until this is patched?
Yeah, so that would exactly be. So I don't know how ConnectWise, if it does sort of work in the Microsoft ecosystem, if it can report device compliance in to whatever the Intune connector is, then you could build a CA policy that said, like, don't let the user access certain things if their device is not compliant. So, yep, you could do that. I think there was.
This is more maybe of a personal opinion from you.
Yeah.
Do you find it more of a higher barrier to entry to understand Entra, Azure, and all of that? Or do you find it's easy to maintain the knowledge once you reach a certain level of understanding within that?
I don't know. I think identity is tough in general. I mean, I like identity, but it's sort of like I don't know. I'd say almost all the above. I think it's difficult, right? I think for a lot of Active Directory people, it can be difficult. For a lot of security people, identity can be difficult. If you're passion driven by identity, I think it's sort of like with most stuff, right? If you invest sort of the time and energy into learning it. Yeah, I know that's like a non-answer, but any other questions? Oh, yeah. Or
Privilege.
which yeah, was it this one?
The secure and privileged access.
Well, which what's
It's the password guidelines on hardening passwords.
let me see if this is. Yeah, and I think there was another question. Well, this one. Okay. I think you had. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about major difference between PIM and PAM.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of a philosophical debate almost. Right. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do in a PAM solution that you can't do with PIM. Right. Like PIM still isn't for Active Directory. Even with some of the write back stuff they're developing, right? Your Kerberos tickets can hold group membership and other things where I'd say it'd be like iffy to use PIM for like 80 security. Right, and then it all gets into sort of like what your organization looks like. There's some things, right, where some orgs like CyberArk because it's sort of like the big brother, right, that watches everything you're doing and records all the stuff you do, right? So some of the decisions about using a PAM solution are, based on your organization's interpretation of like what you need, right, to sort of meet whatever regulatory requirements or your own. Other people will say that PAM can be a substitute for using like privileged access workstations. I tend to argue more, right, that it will increase your surface area with a PAM solution, and also, can you guarantee, right, that the PAM solution will, ensure that if someone's like running Mimikatz on your desktop, right, pretend it's popped, that like they're still not going to get creds to go off and do whatever they want within. Entra. And again, right, it can all sort of snowball because you'd be like, well, my EDR, my XDR would pick that sort of stuff up. But, there's a lot of vendors who are like very much like, right, we're going to do the things that just like 100% stop any sort of attack, right? And I mean, again, I work for a vendor. I know what marketing's like, where it's always sort of like thinking, nobody really can claim like they stop 100% of the things when some sort of 0 day comes out. And sorry, I'm getting a bit soapboxy, but yeah. Oh.
Sorry, were you next? Have you ever seen a user-friendly implementation of a privileged access workstation?
Well, I think that's a culture thing, right? I mean, again, so when I was at the state, so my public sector role, about, almost a decade ago, I had us implement privileged access workstations against Active Directory, and all the people that worked for me hated it. But right, I think some of it's just a culture change thing. Right, But I think also if they didn't really understand like why, right? They're just looking at it from like, I just want them to hate coming to work, versus, you know, seeing then when we had some red team come in and that like, they got domain admin in like 10 minutes or whatever, right? And they're like, oh, like, right, that could be an attacker. No, I mean, I think it could easily sprawl that if you use something like Hello for Business and it's cloud only, right? So if we're just focused on like a GA POA, and really GA is like the only thing I would, for most orgs, would recommend like a POA for. Again, even if you don't do all the Intune stuff, right? Just having a separate device and having them enroll in something like Hello for Business, a lot of the sort of headaches of sort of dealing in that life, right, can go away. I mean, there's still things where, right, you got to watch what you're doing with web browsing and all that, but I'll just, yeah. Okay. I mean, would you?
So,
I can
if you have any additional questions, can we please ask Eric at the back
Yeah.
of the room? Can we give another round of applause for Eric Woodruff and his presentation today? Thank you.